Okay, hello everyone. So this lecture is going to be about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So the basic idea is that when we talk about the expenditure income model, the idea there was that fluctuations in aggregate spending are the main driver of economic recessions and economic booms through this process of the multiplier effect. And we gave some examples of recessions that were kind of really fit this idea well, were the 1930s Great Depression and the Great Recession of 2008. But there are other recessions, like in the ones, for example, that happened in the 1970s during the oil crisis, where oil prices increased, that really don't fit this very well. They seem to be more caused by an increase in the cost of production due to increased oil prices, not so much by a change in spending. And so this would be an example of what we would call a supply shock rather than a spending or demand shock. And so we want to develop a little bit of a model that help us think about these other kind of recessions as well. So to do that, we're going to start by thinking about the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve essentially describes the relationship between the aggregate price level and the quantity of aggregate spending in the economy, which essentially is how much household, business, government, and the rest of the world, that C plus I plus G plus net exports, how does that total amount, total aggregate spending changes as prices change? And so as we see, lower prices make goods cheaper, make firms and businesses and government and foreigners want to purchase more things. That leads to an increase in aggregate spending. And so this is a movement along the curve from one point to the next, okay? So once again, here we have the aggregate price level. Here we have aggregate spending measured by real GDP, and how one relates to the other is given by the aggregate demand curve. So we can derive the aggregate demand curve using the income expenditure model to help us think about that. And so we want to think about how does an increase in the price level affect the aggregate spending. On the one hand, we have what we call a wealth effect, which means that higher average prices reduces purchasing power because things cost more, and so consumers will tend to spend less. Now, there's another effect, which is a little bit more indirect, which we could call it the interest rate effect, which essentially has to do with more monetary factors, which would be as follows. If you have the same number, if the prices go up, now the same number of transactions will require more money. And so in order to obtain that money, households, where do they get that money? They have an increase in their demand for money. They sell bonds in order to sell. They have treasury bonds in their savings account. They sell that to get cash. By selling the bonds, they push the bonds prices down. Lower prices of bonds, since the bond is going to pay you a fixed amount, lower prices today means your return on the bond, which is the interest rate the bond is paying you, is going to go up. And so when you have an increase in prices, that may push the interest rate up. If it pushes the interest rate up, this may in turn make consumption and investment more expensive. And so for that reason, these two effects may be kind of going in the same direction, but for different reasons. One has to do directly with less of purchasing power, means spending less. The other one is that through the interest rate, an increase in prices may push interest rates up, which will also reduce consumption and investment. In general, it's clear that aggregate spending will go down as a result. And so we can see here from our model, remember our equilibrium was given, we started at the original equilibrium point E1. This is the planned aggregate expenditure curve, and where that intersects the 45-degree line, that's our initial equilibrium. Now let's suppose that the prices in the economy go down. That will lead to an increase in aggregate expenditure, planned aggregate expenditure, Now, at the current level of output, aggregate expenditure is bigger than aggregate output, and so output will go up. We have kind of a decrease in inventories. This pushes output up. The new equilibrium is here at a higher level of output, and so this shows as prices go up, equilibrium output. Prices go down, equilibrium output goes up, and so we can essentially keep track of how the equilibrium changes as we change the prices. And so E1 was the equilibrium here when prices were equal to P1. So here we can just go down, and this Y1 is the same as this one. When we move prices down to P2, that pushes the aggregate expenditure curve to the purple level, and now the output becomes Y2. That's another point of the aggregate demand. So the aggregate demand curve, you can think of it as it captures all the ideas we discussed in our income expenditure model, and it follows all the equilibrium points, how they change as you change the price level of the aggregate of the income expenditure model. Okay, so that's what the aggregate demand curve is. Now, the factors that are going to change things are essentially very similar to anything that we discussed in the aggregate expenditure model. Anything that is not a change in the price will be, so if we change the price from P1 to P2 here, we're moving along the aggregate demand curve. But now anything that is not a change in the price that will affect aggregate expenditure, maybe expectations, maybe wealth, maybe the size of existing stock of physical capital, government policies like fiscal policy or monetary policy. We're hearing a lot of examples from the COVID-19 crisis. Fiscal policy will be, for example, you're going to give $2,000 a month paycheck to people. That's an example of fiscal policy. Monetary policy is an example. The Federal Reserve decided to lower the interest rate to zero. It decided to intervene in the financial market and purchase financial assets, and by doing that, conducting an open market operation and dumping a lot of cash into the economy. That's an example of a monetary policy. Those also affect spending. And so when you have a change in a variable that increases aggregate demand for the same price, you will have consumers and firms and the government and so on at the same price. They want to buy more things, so aggregate expenditure moves out, and so the aggregate demand curve pushes up. When something reduces aggregate expenditure, the aggregate demand curve moves down. Here we have a few factors that can affect that. When consumers and firms become more optimistic, the aggregate demand goes up because people spend more when they're more optimistic. Similarly, with changes in wealth, if the stock of the existing if the size of existing stock of physical capital is small, we saw that increases the demand for investment because now we have less machines, and so we want to get to the same level of output, we need to produce more machines. Firms will invest more, and this will increase the aggregate demand. So the lower the level of capital we have today, the increase for aggregate expenditure through investment, and once again, cutting taxes or just giving people a check or in the form of increased government spending will increase the amount of money that people have in their pocket, and so people will spend more. It will push aggregate demand out. Monetary policy, once again, by dumping money into the economy, it lowers the interest rates, it makes people borrowing cheaper, and it also puts cash in people's pocket, and so it will make also aggregate demand go up. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind what is the difference between moving along a curve versus shifting the aggregate demand curve. This is the same idea we've encountered already. So when something, or if we were just some maybe tricky at times, so for example, does a change in wealth move us along the aggregate demand curve or shift it? And the answer depends on what is the reason there was a change in wealth. If the change in wealth is coming because there is a change, so there was a rapid inflation and that's making our wealth decrease, then that's a change in price. So that's a movement along the aggregate demand. If the change is in something else that affects your wealth, for example, the housing market crashes, then there will be a movement off the curve, not along the curve. Now, next, we want to consider the aggregate supply curve. The aggregate, so this is kind of going to be more of a new ingredient that we want to introduce to think about different kind of recession that seem to come more from the production side of the economy. And so the aggregate supply curve shows the relationship between the aggregate price level in the economy and the quantity of aggregate output produced. And so when prices go up, as we will see, the aggregate demand goes up. So the question is, why is that? And the answer is because nominal wages are sticky in the short run. So let's think about what this means. First of all, let's remind ourselves, nominal wage refers to the dollar amount of wage you get paid. Sticky wage means that nominal wages are slow to fall even in the face of high unemployment and maybe slow to rise in the face of labor shortages when the economy is growing very fast. Why is that? Well, maybe when you go to sign a contract with your employer, you sign maybe you're going to be hired for a year, or you're going to be hired for 2 years, and already in the contract your wage is included. And so even if the economy all of a sudden starts growing very fast and there's a shortage of workers, you're not going to renegotiate your wage for 2 years. Similarly, if a lot of people start to get fired, then it may be easier for you to just fire a worker rather than have to reduce wages will already maybe are included in some kind of contract, and the worker will not be okay with taking a wage reduction. And so if we think that wages in the short run are fixed, you cannot change them. They take a little bit of time to adjust, 6 months, a year, we don't know, but there is some stickiness on wages. Then if you look at the profit that the firms are making in the short run, the profit per unit is given by the price minus the average cost, the production cost per unit. And so if prices go up, as we're saying, why does the short run average curve slope upward? Well, let's think about what happens when prices go up. When prices go up, this term here is going up, the price per unit, but the cost you're paying to your workers do not, because wages that you have to pay are fixed, and so you end up having a decrease in profits as a result of prices going up. And so that essentially, your price go up, your wages stay constant, now you have an increase in your profits, sorry. And as a result of the increase in your profit, you're making more money per unit, now you want to sell more units, you want to increase your production. And that's the reason why this curve, as prices go up, the firm want to produce more. And if the prices go down, opposite argument, you want to produce less. Okay. Now, like before, the movement along the supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve, will be a change in prices, but there are other factors that may affect the short run aggregate supply curve. For example, anything that affects the firm's profits, like commodity prices, productivity, maybe changes in nominal wages, and so on. And each of these factors will affect producers' profits, and therefore it will maybe a shift in the short run aggregate supply curve. Okay, and so if something affects profits negatively, the curve shifts back or to the left. If it affects profit positively, it will shift to the right. So, for example, when commodity prices fell, this increases profits and pushes supply up. When nominal wages fall, this also it reduces your cost, and so increases your profits, increases aggregate supply, and increases in productivity also make you more productive, reduce your cost, and increase your aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply curve. Now, the idea the way we're going to think about the situation is that that's what happens in the short run when wages are fixed, but in the long run, the aggregate supply curve is going to show the relationship between the price and the quantity of output, just as before, if all prices, including wages, were fully flexible. And so essentially what the long run is going to capture is what is given the factors of production that we have available, the workers, the machines, and so on, what is the amount of output that we can produce, okay? And we define long run as whatever times it takes for prices to fully adjust, in particular including nominal wages. And now there's no change to profits because essentially all prices, including wages, have changed. We'll look at this in more detail in a second, but essentially the key idea is the idea of potential output. And so the idea is that the long run aggregate supply is the potential output of the economy, is the level of real GDP the economy would produce given all the factors of production in the economy, like the available capital, the available workers, the available technology, and so on and so forth. And so as a fall, let's say there's a decrease in the average price level, it doesn't change the long run capacity that we have to produce. That depends on others, like the number of workers, the number of machines that we have, but it doesn't depend on the prices in the economy. And so essentially we will see about in a moment how that will affect prices and wages, but this long run curve just captures that idea. So you can see that real GDP is almost always either above or below potential output because of this short run fluctuation. So we're never, potential output, you can think of it as where the economy wants to be given its inputs of production, and then actual output, because of fluctuation, is always a little bit above or below. A little bit below, we have a recession like in 2008. A little bit above, we have an expansion like we have in the dot-com boom here in the late 1990s. Now, what is the relationship between the short run and the long run? Now, the idea is that, let's suppose we find ourselves in a situation like point A1 here, where now we have an output that is above the potential output of the economy. Now, we're above the potential output of the economy. Remember, the long run, this tells you how much the economy can produce given all the workers available, the machines, the factories, and so on. If we want to produce more than that, eventually we're going to end up with the factors of production, the workers, and there's not going to be enough workers, and so workers are going to become scarce. If workers become scarce, they will push wages up. Remember, in the long run, in the short run, maybe wages cannot adjust, so we may be here, but then wages adjust, wages go up, and they push the short run supply back to the long run value, okay? So similarly effect here, if you are at the point below the long run potential output, then that will mean that you're producing less than the capacity. There will be empty factory, there will be unemployed workers. This means hiring workers is easy, and so the wages will go down, nominal wages go down, increase profits, and so aggregate short run aggregate supply increases until you go back to the long run value. Okay, so the idea is that the wages will eventually adjust and bring us into the long run, but in the short run, we can be away. The actual output can be different from potential output, just like we saw, just like we saw here in this graph. Okay. So very important for all of these ideas is the idea of sticky wages, this idea that is very controversial among economists. But here we have a little bit of evidence of how do wages change during the periods of economic recession and economic boom. And so what we see in panel A, in a prosperous economy in 1984, as the economy was growing, most of the workers were receiving increases in their wages. There were a few workers who were not receiving any changes. But look at what happened when there was a deeply depressed economy, like in 2012, where the economy was not growing, but you would expect, based on our model, that wages will have to go down, but there was some stickiness that didn't allow, and so most wages will not change. So this indeed provides somewhat of an evidence for stickiness of wages, at least to go down, but even to some extent to up. Okay, so now we can put the aggregate demand and aggregate supply together, and we can define our macroeconomic equilibrium. This will be the short-run macroeconomic equilibrium, where the short-run aggregate supply equals to the aggregate demand. the price level such those two are equal is PE. If price is bigger than that, then expenditure is less than production. There's too much stuff being produced. I will push the price down. If the price is below this equilibrium level, like here, then the aggregate supply is less than what people want to buy, and so there will be shortages that will push prices up, and so we see that the equilibrium will be at this price PE, and the output will be given by YE. So this is the basic of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. I'm going to finish here. Next time, we're going to use this model to think about economic shocks.